Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It is just about time for our session to start. There's probably going to be a few people still trickling in since we are on day one of yet another conference that sees us all staring at our screens and our little boxes of faces across the world. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to this session about what's the password, language and the inclusion of young people in policy spaces. I would like to invite everyone to the session. And I would also like to point out that the session will be in English. So please make sure, well, I mean, we will all speak in English, but then if you would like to have translation in Spanish or Portuguese, you can select the appropriate channel in the globe function at the bottom of your screen, or otherwise select the English channel. So if there's any issue with that, please also just put it in the chat and one of the co-organizers or the technical person can help and can explain what to do. So this session today is organized by the Life and Peace Institute, the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and Interpeace. And all of these organizations are doing work on supporting young people's voices in peace building. And it's a particularly interesting session, I think, and we're very grateful that it can be scheduled for the beginning of this forum, because we hear a lot about the importance of inclusion and including young people in particular. But it's really hard to know sometimes what this inclusion actually looks like in practice. How do we achieve that? And the focus of this session then is really to look at the role of language when it comes to this inclusion. How does language facilitate or block the participation and the meaningful participation of young people? And particularly in the context of the Stockholm Forum, we're looking at that participation in terms of conflict, climate, and peace issues, which is of course a very broad range of issues. So our speakers will share their experiences from their work. And they come from quite a lot of different angles and thematic experiences. So some of them work on climate, some of them work on peace, some on both. Some are more youth activists, some are engaged in policy spaces. And we want to really delve with them into how how language and the use of language can reflect as well as sustain certain power dynamics. Because language in the end determines who's invited to a space and who is not, who is listened to and who is not, whose experiences are valued, or even what type of experience or what type of knowledge is considered as evidence or as knowledge. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I am looking forward very much to seeing where this conversation is going to go today. So introductions then. My name is Hester Grunewald. I am an associate consultant with the Peace Nexus Foundation based in Switzerland. And my own background is from the peace building field. So I've worked quite a lot on conflict sensitivity and also gender in peace building. And in the last few years, I've been co-leading Peace Nexus's work on environmental peace building. So really looking at how to bridge those sectors that work on climate, environment issues and peace. And we have 6 wonderful speakers today. And I would really encourage everyone to look at their full bios on the session outline, because they have such interesting experience and thematic knowledge that they bring. And it will take a long time if we had to go through all of them here. But what I would like to do is to just at least briefly introduce them and their main affiliations, so that everyone at least knows who's in the room and we're on the same page. So firstly, we have Ali Altiok, who is a doctoral student in peace studies and political science at the University of Notre Dame, as we would say in the Francophone countries, with a focus on political inclusion and securitization of young people in the context of peace-building processes. Then we also have Jordan Sanchez, who is a junior at Harvard University studying mathematics, physics, and education, and also a spoken word poet who is dedicated to leaving the world a better place than she found it. Then we also have Elisa Novoa, who is a networks engagement coordinator for youth for the Civicus network. And she focuses on meaningful inclusion for young people in development, human rights, and social justice efforts. We also have Mina Jowri, who is a program specialist in the Peace and Human Security Unit of SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, with experience on conflict, climate, humanitarian response, and gender. And then we also have Noura Baruba, who is president of the National Council of the Swedish Youth Organizations, focusing on advancing the rights and participation of children and youth in Sweden and in the world. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Emma Johnston, who is a youth worker with Youth Action Northern Ireland, and she focuses on challenging the systems that continue to delimit the opportunities and participation of young women. So that's quite a mouthful, that's our panel, and we'll dive with them into some of these questions around participation that we've set out. I also want to just acknowledge and thank Catherine Giccini, who is also on the call. Catherine is a graphic recording artist, and she also has her own background, knowledge and background on development and peace work. And we've asked Catherine to capture some key points through the discussion so that we can produce a poster at the end of the session that gives us a bit of a reminder of the issues we've talked about. And we hope that that can also serve as a bit of a tip sheet for us as we move forward into Stockholm Forum, how we can actively engage and promote these ideas about practically facilitating inclusion of youth voices in these policy spaces. So with that, I just have one last practical point to make before we delve into the next bit, and that is that, of course, we would love to hear from all of you. Everyone in the room, everyone who's participating, you're all here for a reason, you're here with a particular interest, and we'd love to make sure that we hear about those interests. So what we have done is we've designed a Menti survey that we're going to do in a second. And I just want to say that even though the chat is open, we will not be using the chat to get questions or contributions from the chat. We will use the Menti survey for that purpose. But if you want to engage or send or put some thoughts in the chat, you're welcome to do that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Chloe Tricot-O'Farrell, who is the Global Policy Advisor at Life and Peace Institute. And she's going to introduce and lead us through a Menti survey to get some sense of your own experiences and your interests as the whole group. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you very much, Hesta, and hi to everybody. So my name is Chloe, and I will just be accompanying all the participants, speakers and audience included in this first little section of the Menti. So on my screen, or on the screen that's being shared, you should be able to see either a QR code that you can use. There's also a link, so you can go to menti.com and enter the code 3447012. I've also included all of that information in the chat. So there's also the link there. I think there's a direct link and as well as the code. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to join the Menti. So just for your information, for those who have not used Menti so far, you can use on your computer, you can use it also on your phone. And the process is quite straightforward. You'll be invited to answer a few different questions. Some questions are just yes or no, more of a poll, and then some are open questions where you may have a limit in the number of characters, but you will be able to submit multiple answers to those questions. I'm hoping, but that's a plan, that by the end of the conversation, I can also send the results to everybody so that you can also kind of take that immediately away with you from the conversation. So I see that people are joining, but I'm already going to move us into the first questions that people who can join can directly lead us, take part, and answer the first question. And so this is to give you a little taster of what we are hoping to discuss with you all today. So our first question is, have you ever felt excluded either through language or communication in climate, peace and conflict policy spaces? So, you know, some people talk about environmental peace building, some people talk about climate peace and security. We kind of have just used for the benefit of this event, just climate peace and conflict, but we are, you know, we see this as being quite broad and encompassing. Also by language, we talk about, as you may have seen in the description of the session, we think about words used, but also how they're used. Who is seen and who is invited in spaces and who is heard and listened to. So we really kind of understand this to be quite broad. So I see that we have 24 participants so far in the Menti, a resounding yes of people who have felt excluded through language and communication. And of course, our session today is really kind of focusing on young people's inclusion, but also recognizing that everybody here today is either young, has been younger, or might one day be a little bit less young. So we very much also kind of value everybody's experience, from their own personal perspective, and are interested to hear from all of you. There's work going on just above me. If you hear some banging, a new carpet is being installed. So my apologies for any disruption that this may cause. So mindful of time, I'm going to move on to the following question. And people, please, if you haven't yet been able to join the Menti, please feel free. There's always the link at the top of the slide and also in the chat for those of you who are willing to join. So the next question is, are there terms in climate, peace and conflict policy spaces that you find frustrating? And terms can be frustrating for a range of reasons. They can be frustrating because they are overused, because they are politicized, because you don't understand them. There are many that I keep having to go back to Google to understand what they actually mean. And so I see here that we have nexus coming up quite a bit, resilience as well, local goals, leveraging, nexus is coming up again, terrorism, first or second world, stakeholders, capacity, sustainability, peace building practitioners, localization, radicalization, and also to say, as I said at the beginning, the words we use are one kind of component of what we understand language to be, but by no means is it the only kind of issue that language and language practices and communication create. Empower is another word that comes up. A sentence, we have to do something, radicalization, on the ground, localization, global south, vulnerable, local level, green growth, the field. So lots of interesting points coming up, marginalized, migration synergies. And so what I also am inviting all of our speakers to reflect on today is if there's any words that come up that, connect with your experience. And also we really want to finish this conversation with concrete recommendations. So if there's anything that you want to share subsequently, and there'll be space for that in the Menti at the end of this session as well, please feel free to come in. So I will move on to the next slide. So according to you, what are some of the key problems with language and communication practices in climate, peace and conflict policy spaces? So this is a bit broad on purpose, and we have found that when we think about this question in the peace building space specifically with colleagues, there's a range of various different types of problems that are shared. So tokenism is one that is coming up here already. The use of simple words to talk about complex issues. Language is broad and vague. A lot of jargon, generalizations, platitudes, performance, donor-focused language. We're also hoping to be able to address that today. Conversations are siloed. And I think these silos is very kind of pertinent as well when we try and bridge different sectors together, such as climate and peace building, conservation. Young people's perspectives are only welcome within certain thematic areas. People avoid responsibility. I see more points around jargon and who sets the jargon and who sets the language as well. No one that is not an expert would understand the words exactly. So going back to whose language and who sets the language reinforces power structures, lack of ambition, incrementalism, lack of critical voices in the room, lack of transparency or background when data is presented through language. Yes, too much focus on the what and not enough on why and how. Passive language. Unclear multiple definitions across organizations. Culture in spaces that shapes people into the same people. So all of these are fascinating and great, and I will move on to the last question for this segment. Sorry. What do you all wish we could express more or be more open about in climate peace and conflict policy spaces? Inequality, urgency, colonialism, the role of the individual versus governments, gatekeeping, power structures. Identify those who are responsible, be more specific. Responsibility, capitalism, pluralist knowledge sources, very much so. Hypocrisy, yes. Decoloniality, sorry, sometimes I butcher words. Accountability, private sector, the need to speak about the economy. Calling out meaningless language rather than just whispering criticism to the people next to us. How to be transformative, not just adapt to violence and climate change. Race and gender imbalances, ownership. Climate change is not a dichotomy, exactly like positive peace. Catastrophes, Eurocentrism, funding. And so I think all of these are great, and I by no means am trying to put any kind of conclusions or recommendations based on this, but hopefully this is also something that we can all individually bring up in the coming days, today in our session, but also in the coming days of the Stockholm Forum. So on this note, to not take too much time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If there's anyone else who wants to share on this slide, you are more than welcome to. And towards the end of the conversation, I will send back the link for our last 2 questions of the Menti. However, this will be happening offline, so you'll be able to share. I will kind of just give a brief kind of note, as I said, in the chat when I will reopen the last question for final recommendations and thoughts from all the audiences. And on this note, I will hand back over to Hesta. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thanks to all of you for filling in the Menti. Gosh, there's so many things, and some of them are just huge, massive structural issues, and others are kind of behaviors and words and narratives that we can in fact change. And so there's a lot for us to delve into, and we're going to definitely try to bring that in as we go along. What I wanted to do first, I don't want to prejudice the discussion by trying to summarize these impossible themes. There's so many of them, but I wanted to first give our speakers a chance to give us their own reflections from their experience. And so I'd like to ask each of you, I'm going to ask you in turn, to tell us from your experience in the spaces and the themes that you've worked on, why does language matter when it comes to including young people in these policy spaces? So Ali, could you start us off, please?
Sure. So hello everyone, and I hope you can hear me well. So language is a communication tool, of course, like we would all agree with this. So it's the mean for us to actually understand or not understand each other. So I think from my experience, as like coming from more like a research perspective into this conversation, is that the understanding how we understand violence. So linguistic exchange is central to what we call what is called as the epistemic violence, in which the rights, demands, knowledge, and experience of the oppressed group are silenced, or due to, I mean, this is not because people cannot speak, but it's because the listeners or hearers intentionally or unintentionally ignore. So this is about ignorance, and lack of an audience willing to or capable of hearing the oppressed is often the underlying causes of the youth exclusion and marginalization. So this is a generic pattern I see in almost all sectors working on youth. So I will stop here for now.
Thank you, Ollie. And can I just ask you, so we're all remain on the same page, to explain a bit what you mean by epistemic?
Yeah, it's I'm not saying something so scientific. It's just about the knowledges of people, oppressed people, what they know, what they experience. Their experiential knowledge is just ignored. Like it's basically what I'm saying is knowledge, nothing so scientific or differently than what we understand from knowledge. The way we know things is what I mean by epistemic here.
Thank you so much. And it's such an important point, particularly from a research perspective, when we're talking about what generating evidence often for policy decisions. What does that evidence look like, and who gets to frame it and articulate it? So thank you so much, Ali. Jordan, as a poet, I'm sure language is super central to what you do. So what's your experience of this?
Yes, of course. For me, language is not only a means to communicate ideas, but evoke emotion and inspire. So it's a little bit different from Ali and other people involved in research and academia, as my goal isn't always to communicate an idea in the most clear and exact way with as much nuance as possible, but really focusing on inspiring others and getting them energized, because I think that's what is kind of the root of change and how we can start to change things. When we are whenever I'm participating in an event, sometimes I feel like I'm a middleman. I'm almost looking at the research that people like Ali are doing and distilling that into something that's more relatable to the everyday person. So I feel like I'm kind of bridging between the two, which is definitely a unique role to be in. But I also think sometimes the way I use language also reveals that I'm not a part of the decision-making process, but rather I'm there to start an event, or I'm there to kind of get people in the right mood, but not necessarily suggest specific action. So although I think there are definitely a lot of advantages to being in the position I am, I think there's also kind of a way of almost like of exposure of being like, okay, you see who I am and what I'm here for, but also what I'm not. So I think language definitely plays an important role when we see those power dynamics, but also kind of acknowledging our own role in communities.
That's great. Thanks, Jordan. So there's that sense of language as an emotive, motivating thing, but also does that then become a show and it's sidelined from the actual decision making and the powers that are in charge of that process? Elisa, do you want to talk a bit more from your perspective, especially given your network and collaborative background?
Sure, thank you very much. I agree with Ali and Jordan. For me, language matters also because it's a tool to shape the culture. It shapes our ways of thinking, our understanding of the world, and how we behave in the world. And a fun example that always surprises me is the power of the Bible. It's one little book, well, actually very big, translated to more than 700 languages, that managed to shape more than half the world's points of view and paradigms and how we take decisions. So imagine if us, as development practitioners, human rights defenders, UN representatives, government officials, start talking about peace, climate, inclusion, justice, beyond the 5 UN languages and beyond the typical spaces that the report, for example, was highlighting at HLPF, but also the others, COP, whatever, and the power that could have, right? So for me, is that matter a tool that shapes our culture.
Thanks so much. Yeah, very powerful imagery and how language can bring us together and can take us forward in a specific direction when used properly or productively. And Mina, from a policymaking perspective, where do you see the importance of language?
Thank you so much, Hester, for previous speakers as well. I agree with what has been said. So I'm working at SIDA we are a government agency, donor agency, and we're working on behalf of the Swedish government. So we don't really see ourselves as policymakers, but we do navigate in those waters and policy waters, and we also work in partnerships, work with organizations that are influencing policy spaces. So we are taking impressions from everywhere, I would say. And coming from, I've been working with various NGO organizations before I joined SIDA. I know that language matters because it affects the way you implement things, the way you do things. So when there is a buzz floating around, buzzword like, say, triple nexus, localization, resilience, or any of those words that has been put out before on the Menti, you need to think of those words as an implementing organization. What does that mean to us? Does this mean that we have to do something differently? Are we doing it already, perhaps? Should we reframe our work? How should we present results according to this new language structure? So I think it definitely has impacts on the way you do things. And also coming from a donor agency, I think we should be very aware of the way how language affects implementation. Yeah, so I stop there for now.
Thank you, Mina. And it's a nice reference back to this jargon issue that we picked up. And, who knows what the nexus means? There's so many different nexuses in the different sectors. And then how do people really engage with that and make it practical and really put it into their operations and projects? Noura, we'd like to hear from you next with your interesting set of experiences.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm clearly not a linguistic expert, but I'll share my personal experiences. So for me, language is key to understanding and shaping our history, present, and future. Because language creates and helps form our realities. So we need to be mindful about the language we use and the things we speak or don't speak into action, but also about who has the power over language, who has a voice, who is listened to, who's in a room, who's not in a room. I think there are three specific aspects that I would consider. The first is culture and the normative effect of language. And with normative, I mean like the values and how we shift the scale in society. I said the words that we put into the world shape culture, they shape conversation, they shape ambition. So I often feel that our language is part of keeping the status quo or limiting our imagination. Because if we don't put words into our ambition, it will remain part of the margin. And it can be language that makes us understand the severity of a challenge, or language that pushes this normative discussion into a new reality. What we talk about and what we don't talk about shapes us, it shapes our actions, and it shapes our realities. The second quickly is communication and inclusion. Language is all about communication. And we have a world in cascading crisis, complexity. It's practically impossible to understand everything that is going on. And I feel we are not doing enough to use language as a connecting tissue to bring people into the conversation. And by using language that is exclusionary or difficult to understand, we keep people outside of the conversation. And lastly, power. I think Ali, Jordan, Elisa and Mina all spoke about this, but who has power over the conversation? Who's in the room, who's not in the room, who has a voice, who shapes the agenda, and what's the threshold of joining the conversation?
Thanks, Noura. Such important points, and this idea also particularly of stitching people together with the use of language and communications, and how bad we do at that quite often, how bad we are at it. Thank you so much. And then Emma, from your youth-focused experience and young women in particular, what does language mean to you in this inclusion context?
Hi everybody, and thanks to all the rest of the speakers for your lovely inputs. I suppose for me, working with young women every day, it's about using language to really ignite their passion. So some of them often feel like they aren't connected to policy spaces, they don't feel they're connected to climate or any of the wider issues. So for me, I use language to create a fun and dynamic way for education. So for me, education is most important when we think about language. It's how do we encourage young women to learn and grow and be able to have their input, because a lot of the time, for me, we bring young people into the space, but we can very often blanket young people as a wider group. When we're talking about individuals, we're talking about humans, we're talking about people that have a lived experience that's so unique and special to them. But if they haven't got the confidence through their language to articulate that in a way that ensures that that is raised to the fore, then we can be disempowering them, I suppose, in some way. So for me, it's not just about passing the mic or bringing them to the table. It's about making sure that they have the education and the confidence. So then we do bring them to the really important spaces that we've nurtured them as people, so that they can, you know, be able to feel confident in their way. And I suppose being from Northern Ireland, language has been really important in our peace process. We've, you know, the Good Friday Agreement is in its anniversary last Friday of 24 years. And I think it's been a critical part of our dialogue here. And but I think it's about keeping it relevant and keeping it creative and not living in that past, but how do we build on that landscape to make it real and keep it real for young people of the here and right now. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. And this notion of language that helps to bring people in, empower them, educate them where necessary, so that they can bring what they have to offer already into these spaces. So that's a great kickoff to start with the importance of language. And what I wanted to do was to move on next to the challenges of how language actually excludes young people. So we've touched on some of them. We've talked about jargon, we've talked about power dynamics, we've talked about some of these in the Menti, there were people saying about some of the words that irritate them, like that I'm guessing would be things that label young people. So for instance, if you think of discussions around terrorism or radicalization, that puts people in boxes from which they can't really come out and bring what they can to the table. So I would love to hear from you all, from our speakers. What have you seen as particular challenges to young people being able to voice their views in these policy spaces, and what have been the consequences of that? So if they've not been able to participate meaningfully, what resulted from that? What were some of the consequences? I'm going to just start from the bottom up, if that's okay. So Emma, that would mean you go first, if you're all right with that.
Of course. So it's interesting on the Mentimeter, because some people talked about too much talking and not enough action. And for me, everything, it's strategy, strategy, strategy. And sometimes the actions don't come as part of that. So I suppose for me, also what was mentioned was gatekeeping. So sometimes the agenda that's operating through language is working for the people that are in power. So therefore, it can become a challenge to try and unpick that. I believe that we have created a society where we are afraid to lean into discomfort, when we know within peace building and climate activism and all of these areas that it are the critical conversations that are really difficult to have that are actually the best and the ones that breed the best possible outcomes. So for me, like, for example, if there was a room full of Emmas right now, I would be completely bored because I have a perspective. But I think, especially through the youth work mechanisms that I have, it's about that integration. It's about that collective, seeing ourselves as being so interconnected, and how the actions of myself and others impact on everyone globally. And that's what's beautiful about today. It's that we're all here from so many different places, but we're here in solidarity, trying to demonstrate that whoever's agenda might be in play that continues to delimit people's opportunities or create inequality, that there's so many of us, and when we breathe collectively into a space like this, then we can start to unpick and create really positive steps to ensure that these challenges don't remain challenges, that young people, for example, don't remain tokenistic, that they have their place and their space, and that we can educate them to move forward into that. So thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And you've also started giving some solutions there in some ways, some recommendations. So we're gonna come back to those as well. Noura, did you want to jump in on that question of the challenges? What's challenging and what are the consequences of that exclusion?
Absolutely. I feel like I could sit here for a week and talk about the challenges, but I'll try to keep short. I was talking about this complexity issue before, and I think this complexity issue is the root cause of a lot of challenges when it comes to language and inclusion, because we've tried to simplify things by putting a lot of meaning behind very few words. We saw some of them in the Menti, like resilience, nexus, global, local, sustainability, ecosystem, participation, even peace, that we have started to either water down the meaning of these concepts or that so many different challenges or solutions hide behind them. And I think it would be difficult to join any of these conversations as someone who's really a practitioner to share your specific experiences holding on to these concepts. Because we have found ourselves now in conversations that at the same time are very complex and jargony. And if you don't know these concepts or these words, the conversation is impossible to join. But I would also say that it means that many of the conversations we have, they tackle everything and nothing at the same time, which becomes an issue. For example, I have my definition of participation. It's very wide, and we can have a conversation about participation and inclusion for an hour and say the exact same words, but we mean different things. So I think we need to focus more on specificity and actually enable voices to come into rooms with their specific experiential knowledge, and to lower these thresholds that you have to be an expert or use these types of jargons. But some of the challenges that I find myself, I really recognized myself in Jordan's explanation before, this kind of translator role, because I work both with young people, youth organizations on these, and we have our own jargon and terms, and in the policy space, and also having background in government, I can understand those settings. So I often feel that I'm like a translator between the policymakers and young people and policymakers. And in the end, it becomes like opposite inclusion, because I don't think policymakers are making enough of an effort to actually understand diverse voices, or to hear these very practical suggestions that young people come with. If you're from an indigenous organization or a rural organization, for example. And the second challenge, I feel that it's not just about language and words, it's also about framing. We as young people, we come into spaces and need to engage with the frameworks that others have defined, programmed, and designed. And it impedes what we can discuss or how things can be discussed. And we essentially inherit a discussion culture when we join these conversations. We're expected to behave in a certain way. We're expected to talk in a certain way. We're expected to look a certain way. So I always tell people in my movement that, you don't have to join these spaces and join these spaces as yourself. Don't put on that black suit unless you want to, and use these words, use the slang that you use, and come into this conversation with your unique personality and background. But essentially, I think this creates a disconnect between the discussion and participants, and it's difficult to align yourself with the culture that you're joining in these policy spaces.
Yeah. Thank you, Nira. And it is interesting, this idea of having to translate between different audiences, and then also this thing about if you show up as who you are, will you be listened to? And so I wanted to also, in the context of then thinking about the challenges, mainly for you, Mina, because your role is also positioned in a way to facilitate that input into policy making, as you were explaining. And I wondered if you can also reflect a little bit as part of these challenges, whether these challenges are specific to young people, to what extent it's specific to young people, rather, that it's this difficult translation role and getting these different voices into policymaking. To what extent is that specific to young people's contributions in your experience?
Well, actually, that's a quite difficult question to answer, because if I think of the topic of this conference that we are all in, this intersection between environment, climate, peace and security, that is an evolving issue. That's a thematic area that is, when we talk about it in policy space, it's relatively new to other framings, if you want to, conceptual framings. And it's especially in the way that there's a mix of people coming from various sectors, environment sector, peace building sector, speaking two different languages. There are different jargons, conceptual framings, and understanding of the issues and technical expertise. So I guess for people in the room, it can be difficult to follow. So definitely yes, for young people as well, as it is for many, many others. However, I do think that it's important to not be too positive about finding a common language that would work for everyone. I've heard that several times. We need to find a language that can be understood. We need to find the way to frame this. I don't think we will come to that point, just because this is an issue that reflects various sectors, and people will not be ready to give up their conceptual framings, which is also power in their bubbles. So I think that what we do need, I'm trying to come to a point here where I'm relating to the young people, is for the issues that are being discussed in these policy spaces must quickly be translated to the people who needs what is being said, to the people who needs the information and who needs knowledge, and also who needs to feed into the conversation. So make it relevant to those who need it. And that is definitely young people, because I think 90% of the world's youth population lives in countries affected by these multiple crises. So there's a big problem with not having them included, and where language obviously is a barrier. And yeah, I can go on about that. I mean, the participation of young people is really important here to fully understand the consequences of the problems that we're talking about, and also to make sure that their leadership is there as part of the policy discussions and to guide future action with their ideas, but not the least to make sure that what is being said in policy spaces also trickles down and translates to something in the spaces, in the social networks, in the movements that young people are involved in, be it this nexus, or be it peace or climate action.
Absolutely. So there are several layers of complexity there. It's complex to talk about these issues in connection, and then within that, the language, the jargon, that becomes difficult for everyone involved, and even more difficult for young people who are supposed to be taking this forward and trying to well, we're going to have to work with this in the decades to come.
Yes, and I could just add one thing, and that is that we don't have time to wait for the language to come, because the climate crisis is quickly evolving as peace. The conflict context is also, I mean, these dual crises are really impacting us, so we don't have time to wait for language. We need action, and that's why language has to be translated quickly. That was my initial point.
Absolutely, and also reinforced by some of the comments in the Menti around urgency. And so, Elisa, I want to ask you then, particularly with your hat as a collaborator, coordinator of multiple organizations, where you see that some of the challenges that Mina was also raising about translating this language, multi-sectoral language and jargon into action. How does that look like in your space?
Sure, thanks. And I wish I could give you a hypothetical example or an old example, but this is a very real story that just happened last week. And it's because I don't know if you know, but we as you said, we work with lots of organizations and individual activists, philanthropic organizations, institutions, whatever. And in the youth work stream, the youth department in particular, we receive very often requests from whether donors, NGOs, whatever, to connect them with young activists for a consultation, an event, a survey. This case was a consultation on peace and security. And they said, hey, so we're looking for a group of young people from North America, between these ages, who are familiar or have worked in issues of peace and security. So can you just send it to those that already have experience and who speak English? I'm like, 1 second. North America officially has 3 languages, and still more if we include the native languages, that it's a must. And two, as Ali was saying, what about lived experiences? Why do we need only to include the young people who went to the university and studied this, or went to the UN meeting or to the NGO meeting and have like the certificate of, oh, you attended a peace and security event, so you know what you're talking. No, let's dismantle that systems, include the lived experiences, include different narratives, different jargons, and take that time and resources to invest in connecting with all young people, because all experiences are valued. And then this consultation that was meant to design a new program or a new campaign will actually have an impact and will make sense and will be resonate. It will not be a consultation, it was even called listening session. It would not be an echo chamber where we are just looking for people to tell us, young people to just say, thanks for coming. We're gonna take a picture. We did the tokenistic thing of consulting you. You said what we wanted to hear. That means that our great idea and our great project is amazing. And no, we need conflict. We need different perspectives. We need confrontation and diversity for finally find a solution to what Mina was saying of this enormous, constant, rapid, and urgent issues that we are all being chased all the time. So implications,
Absolutely.
tons.
Absolutely, and you've already started making a recommendation there in terms of at least expand the scope of the consultations. At least just don't reach out to the usual suspects, so to speak, when you're consulting with young people on some of these policy issues. And Jordan, I'd love to hear from you as well. You already highlighted some challenges in your initial remark. Are there 1 or 2 others that you want to point out in terms of young people's participation?
Yeah, definitely. I'm 20 now, but I've been kind of doing a lot of poetry in activism and advocacy spaces since I was maybe 15. So I've been doing this since I was quite little. And the biggest issue I see when it comes to youth participation, I think it's kind of split into 2 sectors. The first one is that young people feel like they can't speak to begin with because they don't feel connected. And then the second thing is that young people want to speak, but they don't feel listened to. So going back to the issue of connection, I think the biggest thing is reminding people that this is their world, no matter how old or young they are, that they too have the power to change it, have the power to get involved. And I think the easiest way to do that is making it accessible. And I think accessible is a word that we use a lot all the time with a very open meaning. But what I mean specifically in this case is making it so that the language is easily connected to. So that means using simple words to communicate complex ideas. And I know sometimes people are kind of not always excited to do that because it means they're worried about losing the complexity of the issue or losing the nuance. But to me, that means that doesn't mean use less words, that means use more sentences so that people are able to understand the entirety of what you mean instead of just trying to Google every other word that's being spoken. And I too am victim of that whenever I'm invited to a lot of these spaces. So that's the first issue of people feeling like they can't even speak because they're not even included in the discussion. The second element of wanting to speak but not feeling like you're going to be heard, so what's the point? I think the greatest way to kind of deal with that or address it is actually acknowledging that people feel listened to, or making people feel listened to begin with. So when you're having a one-on-one conversation with someone, like you're making eye contact, you're nodding your head. But when it comes to larger discussions and organizations, it means using the ideas and phrases that they said as motivators for the decisions that you make, as justification, using that as valid evidence instead of formal studies and research papers. So I think it definitely comes as not really a one-size-fits-all solution or issue. We really have to kind of address the two different groups and the two ways that these challenges kind of arise.
That's great. Thank you, Jordan. And already some very concrete recommendations there. It makes me think a little bit about, you know, when we speak about gender, and I imagine it's the same because I'm no longer young enough to know, but I imagine it's the same where you're sort of sitting in a meeting and you say something and then a male colleague picks it up and everyone goes, oh, that's such a great point. And you're thinking, I said that. And it's not reflected that it came from you. You know, there might be some of that dynamic also happening when young people are in the room and may be listened to, but not quite acknowledged in the way that they should be for the contributions that they bring. So there's a practical point for all of us. Let's listen and let's also acknowledge that contribution. And Ali, from your research experience in the academic environment, it's probably quite a different set again of this whole having to prove yourself and research experience and all of that. What do you see as some of the challenges there for young people?
Thank you, Esther. I have more research experience in the policy field than the academic research experience. So it might kind of, I may speak more about the policy space that we are kind of trying to concentrate. So
please, yes.
What I would say is that the policy space, I mean, uses a lot of colonial jargons from colonial history. I mean, the terms that we are so casually used on the ground, in the fields, basically rooted in the colonial history of inequalities. It's basically we are creating a power dynamics, is that we are at the top and the others are on the ground in the field. So we think that we are saying something meaningful, but actually we are reproducing the violence that we try to counter. So but let me speak more about young people. I mean, how we use language really determines like inclusion or exclusion of young people. Policy space usually, I mean, very often speaks about hard to reach young people. And my colleague who's also in the audience right now, Graham Simpson, in his Missing Peace study, framed the problem very well. And he said, you know, and Jordan just also like mentioned a similar phrase, is that young people are not hard to reach, they are just not listened to. So, I mean, this is the core of the problem about language here in young people's experience. We know that there's abundance of young people creating, innovating new words, meanings, challenge irrationality of the peace and security space or climate inaction of the policy. So, but the way language used is that basically excludes or oppress those activists. I mean, language is never neutral or never technical only. So it's either used as a repression tool or it can be used as to counter repression. So how, I mean, I will just give one example about the term that we kind of spoke quite a bit right now already in this talk, is the youth radicalization. Today, I mean, the way radicalized youth in its essence is something, the celebration of actual radical democracy, radical education. It was something good. But today in the policy world, the way we speak about radicalized youth is that presents young people as a terror threat, as a risk, liability, and this is the language used in the national or international security documents. So it's contestation over these concepts should be central to peace building, should be central to climate action, because reclaiming the language of radical youth is the only way we can actually develop meaningful responses to, like, you know, this climate injustice, climate change response we need could be only developed through, actually, if we embrace the radicalism of young people. Do I have still time? Should I continue speaking, or I just want to be mindful?
Please give us another one, Ali, and you've already suggested a recommendation as well, so that's useful.
Yeah, and what I also want to say is that the way language is also a meaning-making process for us, how we understand the world. So institutions, governments speak very frequently about including youth. So inviting into our table, inviting in our spaces. And this is framing young people as passive agents to be included. But actually, young people see their own inclusion differently. This is like the point Nora was making, is the way young people understand inclusion and participation is their own, they have their own understanding. And until we understand how young people see their own inclusion, we will continue to fail in creating youth inclusive policy spaces.
Great, thank you, Ali. And if I can put you on the spot a little bit, then going back in the other direction now, because we want to put on the table a few suggestions for practical things that could be done in the rest of this week at this forum, but also in future, of course. How do we actually behave differently to address some of these challenges that you've outlined? So so I'm wondering, just for instance, on your last point, Ali, or you could speak to one of the others if you would like, how can we all listen to young people? How can we all understand better what how young people see their own inclusion, so that we can help make that happen?
Yeah, so basically this has to be a listening exercise rather than, I mean, I will give another example. So recent years, I start seeing that the policy space starts creating a new position in the meetings. We moved from keynote speaker to keynote listeners. It sounds like a great step. Maybe it's a good step, but we still keep the keynote, the power dynamics in that language, is that the one who listens actually matters, not you that you speak. And we kind of reproduce the same problem in different ways instead of addressing it. So I don't know if I'm making the case, but what I'm trying to say is that you need to create the circle where everyone sits equally on the same level. If you're organizing a meeting in the policy space for meaningful inclusion of young people, that's the number one rule, I think.
Thanks, Ali. I'm going to put it a bit more open for the rest of the speakers. Who wants to bounce off that and come up with some recommendations, either around how do we listen better, or how do we change the language so that it's easier for young people to come in? Which of the speakers would like to jump in on that? Elisa, please.
Thank you very much. Just bouncing on that idea, I love it. Like the listening keynote a star. We'll try it. And unconnected, I think there's an exercise not only for this conversation, but also in the anti-racism and gender equality, everything. It's starting about thinking of our own privilege, no? So if we are here as facilitators, as intermediaries, to bring different voices to policymaking processes, why are we here? Who are we? And how are we going to do this? Starting a non-learning process and putting the resources into it, right? So yes, we cannot have one language. So what does it cost to have all languages and put the money there? What human resources does it cost to bring as many resources, as many voices together? Let's put them in. But stop doing this kind of work with very limited funding, because it's not going to be effective or sustainable, or it's not going to arrive anywhere, right? So we really, really want to listen and have all voices together and a language that everyone understands, and we know the complexity of those definitions. We need to put the resources to translate those complexities and the willingness, of course. So yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Elisa. And it's both the language, the translation into other languages, and using more sentences, as some of you have previously said, rather than just trying to squeeze everything into one word. Anyone else want to jump on that? Noura, yes.
I think Jordan was before me.
Sorry, Jordan, I didn't see.
No, you're good. And thank you, Nora. I just wanted to kind of pose a question. If you're inviting someone to speak at something, why are you inviting them? Like, just kind of get clear on your motivation for that. And secondly, are you expecting something from them specifically? I think it's okay to invite people because you know that they have experience in XYZ and that experience is relevant to the topic of discussion. But you also need to think, am I having them here to kind of perform and make people sad so that they're able to kind of buy into the solution that I'm selling them? You just need to kind of be mindful of that and the role that each person is playing and whether or not there should even be a role. And then, as I said earlier, simplify language, not ideas, like use more sentences instead of complex words. But I just wanted to highlight something from my own kind of experiences as a poet specifically. I've written so many poems. Some of them have included a list of statistics and others have just been kind of me speaking about my childhood experiences. And the things that have connected with people the most have been me talking about dodgeball and team sports and playing soccer and how that's related to climate action, and literal phrases that are just big problems start with little ones and solutions are the same way. I think sometimes we underestimate the impact of simple, straightforward language. And then one more thing I wanted to say about youth participation and what that looks like for each person. Meet people where they are, but also allow people to speak to what they can. It does no good for anyone to have a young person who is comfortable speaking out one or two things, but you're asking them to speak about something they have no experience in. Then they're not actually able to kind of give an input that is impactful or useful. So just make sure that you're meeting people where they are, connecting things to real experiences, real impacts, action items that people can do, whether they're an individual or a member of a larger community or organization. And of course, just allowing people to speak to what they can and valuing lived experience.
Thanks, Jordan. And I love that idea of really remembering why you invited somebody. You didn't invite them just because they're young. You invited them because they bring something to the table, and kind of to break down those kind of tick box formats and really listen to people and bring in the real experience into the conversation. And Noura, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And to build on a couple of the things, the first I would say is take a critical look at your own culture, because your own culture defines also the expectations of people coming into the room. And there's no point in diversity if everyone is expected to behave the same, speak the same, be the same. And think about it critically. We had this exercise in one of my organizations several years ago where we had a dress code for certain events, which is ridiculous. And many people who otherwise would have loved to join did not join because they were expected to come to this literal room looking the same. And I would also say that one of the things that we have to address is laziness. I often don't think it's bad intentions, but we don't make enough effort to actually have a thorough process with diversity of people who sets the agenda, who decides who's in the room, who sets the culture, the framing, the language, the questions, the discussions, the follow-up. Like, we need to think about this thoroughly. And likewise, it's not hard to reach. You are bad at outreach. And I face this very often because I'm representing an umbrella organization for youth organizations. And we get all the invitations, like all the invitations that has the word youth or future or something. And I keep telling the ministries or agencies, like you have to realize that there are hundreds and thousands of organizations in this country. Like you have to make a better effort at doing outreach. We can't be your only entry point to have a token in the room, because that's what it sometimes feels like. And we come with this more meta conversation, but they had invited our Sami indigenous organization instead to speak on those issues, they would be so clear in the things that they would communicate. And then I think one recommendation I would have for youth is something that we've tried to work more on, is we realize that the policy space is very difficult to shape if you don't have a process that starts with values that shapes norms, that shapes culture, that shapes public opinion, that shapes policy. And in civil society, because we have so many different other expectations, administration roles, more and more service delivery, we've kind of forgotten this kind of movement building role of organizations, or not forgotten, but we're thrown under a lot of other things to do. And to kind of revitalize this movement thinking in organizations, and using language and the contestation of language in that kind of battle for the policy space as well.
Thank you so much, Noora. And I think also that point about the resources and the proper outreach and who do you reach, it is a bit what's easiest to just contact the umbrella network. I'm conscious of time, but I want to give Emma and Mina also their last word on recommendations before we check in on what Catherine's been doing. So Emma, you want to start?
Yeah. I suppose for me, it's really important that we create really creative and dynamic and innovative spaces for this dialogue and this language to take place, because we are dealing a lot of the time with a lot of contentious issues. But I suppose it's how do we create those spaces that people actually want to be part of, because I know I've been in plenty of spaces where I kind of wish I hadn't been there because of the way it's pitched or the approaches that were used. So I suppose in youth work, we try to keep it really, the methodology that we use, we try to speak to the needs of young people by co-designing with them. So recently we did a hustings event we had elections there a few weeks ago, and we called it Pizza and Politics. So we had invited the representatives from all the political parties to come to inspire the young people to vote for them. So these are people who are coming from families that have never voted or always vote on religious basis. So what we did was we got the young people in for the hour before, and we used Mentimeter, and we got them thinking about, what do you think of when you hear the word politics? So it was like, oh, boring, nothing to do with me. So we unpicked that. What do you hear when you hear the word voting? Similar kind of thing. But then we asked them, what are the 3 things that you're most passionate about? And it was climate change, mental health, funding, like poverty, all these really fantastic things up on the screen. And we said, right, well, this is all politics. So based on what you've come up with, we want you to devise two questions in your table for the political representatives. Then we had pizza, of course, in the break, which is great. And then for the second half, when the political representatives came in, the young people were motivated, inspired, ready to just have that exchange with them. So if we hadn't have done that hour before and we left it completely blind, I assume I would have a perception from our youth committee team that the young people, we would have said, oh, what questions have you got? And they would have could have possibly just blinked it. But because we used that nurturing space, it really helped the process to flourish. And I think we were keeping the needs of young people at the heart of the decisions that we were making. And I think that's why it worked.
That's great. And I wish we could have had pizza with this conversation. That would have been even better. Great idea. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Mina, last chance to you, 30 seconds, please.
Wow, 30 seconds. Okay, I had so many points. It's okay. So just a few general points on policy spaces. I think one thing is really preparing the spaces to make sure that the language is understood beforehand so that we know what we're going to talk about. And also actually making sure to explain where we come from and what is our understanding of the issue, because I think it will matter when you explain what your understanding of the issue is and why you understand the issues the way you do. And participation also on, I mean, beyond meaningful participation in policy spaces actually reflect on what do we want my meaningful participation to lead to when people go home, young people, how are they going to use this information and language where in the spaces they work in? And of course, not to treat young people as a homogeneous group. There are so many varieties of voices in the group of young people, so that should be definitely considered. And when we have this in policy spaces, and that also think that there is no such thing as youth issues. I mean, when we talk about climate and security, that's actually universal. There are other reasons for including youth than just treating them as youth. So that's a few points. And also coming from a donor agency, I think, coming back to my first point on the complexity of this issue in this conference, I think one thing that is really crucial is for donors to invest in long-term partnerships, because conversation takes time, language understanding around the issues will take time, and also encourage work across sectors and across generations.
Absolutely. Yeah, really important, Bina. Thank you. And thank you for bringing that point about the long-term partnerships. We've talked about resources in terms of the consultation process, but not so much about resources needed to really get to know the partners and give them the resources they need to develop things long-term. So that's really, really important. I'm aware that we have 5 minutes left in the session. So I would like to suggest that, Catherine, if you can share your screen, and at the same time, I'm going to, so we can just at least see what Catherine's been up to. And just to say, she will finish it after the session, and we'll make it available through the social media channels of the organizers. Wow, that looks amazing. And so while we look at that, I would hand over also to Danica for a few remarks to connect us back from this conversation into the rest of the forum. Over to you, Danica.
Thank you so much, Hesta, and thank you to our speakers for a fascinating conversation. I think the notepad next to me looks much less organized and creative, but is also full of a lot of thoughts. I just wanted to bring a few additional observations into the conversation and link it back with the conversations that are taking place around us at Stockholm. I'm the YPS program manager at Interpeace, where we've become very familiar with the dynamic properties of language in our peace building work, and being able to identify where fixations on language can entrench divisions, but also where language has become or can become more fluid in practice. Particularly when the complexity of lived experience is acknowledged and becomes part of the genuine exchange that is so critical to building peace on the basis of mutual dignity and respect. And in this year's Stockholm Forum, we're looking at how the climate crisis is an urgent threat to the many different intersecting areas of work that we all come from, including on areas of human rights, peace and security, development. And we can acknowledge how we don't have all of the solutions. That seems like a common refrain. And yet it's unclear if we're really changing how we do business. As Ali said, we may be perpetuating power imbalances, even as we seek to make adjustments to the seating at the table. And as Elisa noticed, are we dismantling systems of exclusion, or are we just tweaking the sound quality of pre-existing echo chambers? And young people, though, are bringing so many innovative ideas to the table, and also bringing the urgency that is so required to meet the honestly very startling demands of the moment when it comes to climate and the impacts of climate. And on Interpeace's Outside the Box platform, where we host a number of youth authored policy briefs, one of our youth authors, for example, points to the need to speak meaningfully, to young people in a meaningful way on looking at integrating climate adaptability strategies into urban planning, which often is a process that can become very technical and where young people are often not consulted despite their lived experiences. And another highlights the importance of looking at incorporating youth priorities on climate into political platforms, where these youth priorities are often expressed, as some of our speakers discussed, through informal protests and informal channels, which requires a certain translation in terms of words used and power shared. And as mentioned in this discussion, we have words like radical and political, which can be used against young people to alienate and disempower them, despite the fact that a lot of the people at the Stockholm Forum are calling for radical and political change to meet the moment. A few months ago, and I'll just end with a quote I heard from a young person at an event, which is a metaphor that continues to stick with us in our work, that a conversation between youth and institutions or policymakers can be compared to butterflies beating against standing stones. How do you create an exchange between those who aren't used to speaking and those who aren't used to listening? And I think this appears particularly true on climate, where youth are speaking and they are trying to enter this space, but there doesn't appear to be, despite an acknowledgement of the need, an understanding of how to facilitate and institutionalize this kind of nuanced exchange from the level of decision makers. And so I'm hoping that what we've produced today in terms of good practices and ideas will be helpful to all of us as we continue, not just at the Stockholm Forum, but in our work, to remember how important it is to facilitate a responsive exchange in which young people can lead and actually redefine the narrative through which decisions are made, particularly when it comes to climate. Thank you so much, Hesta.
Thank you so much, Danica, and it's a great summary as well of so many of the issues. And thank you, Catherine, for this amazing artwork. I hope it's going to be a good cheat sheet for us all moving forward. So it just is left to me to thank all of our speakers for your contributions. I wish we had much more time to delve into all the different themes that came up, and also to all the participants. And as you would have seen in the chat, the results of the Menti have been shared there. And I believe we're also in a position to share the email contacts of all of the speakers, or all of the people involved in the session, in case anyone wants to follow up further. So thank you very much. And with that, I close the session.